Okay, any questions before I get started? Any questions about anything? Class, lab, readings? Yeah. You can do either. I'll have boxes down in the basement at Haviland that are labeled, so you can do that, or just you can do the online if you want. So either one's fine. Okay, I just want to point out a couple things. Everyone was so polite that I'm having 2 classes on B-Space, and I had a totally random title for the last assignment. It had nothing to do with case control data, which I'm sure must have thrown you for a loop, because that's my other class, which I know is not a good sign. But I fixed it, and so it's too late for you, but it says assignment 1 now. It doesn't say case control. So it had nothing to do with case control. The other thing that's more substantive is I put several new electronic books on the side that I just recently discovered they have electronic copies of. 2 of them are in particular quite useful. One is this handbook of statistical analyses by Sophia Rabe-Hesketh, who's in the Department of Education, and so it's quite a nice book. I mean, we will actually use some of the material in here. She does have some stuff on longitudinal data and some plotting that's very nice, and so it's a great book. And the other one, which I'll make some suggested readings for, but the only reading is going to be essentially the chapters in the book I'm writing with Nick. But this Weiss book is nice. Actually, it's a good book, and it has it's nice material to go along with this course. It's very similar to the kind of material we cover in this course. So that's another thing that's available. Again, you have to be on campus because these are copyright protected, or you have to be VNC some way in. I'm sure I know those that don't know how to do that. I can sort of steer you how to if you're off campus, but otherwise, if you're on campus, you can get them and download them as PDFs, or you can use, when available, that reader that comes with some of these books, eBrary or something. I can't stand it, but it's possible to do that. Okay. All right, so just a quick summary of where we are. So today is February 5th, and we're on lecture, the 3rd set of slides. And, we've covered some basic background material up to this point. I haven't really talked that much about longitudinal data, except to give some examples of the type of data sets we're going to see. And then what you did in lab and what we've done in here some is review regression. What is regression modeling? Why do people use regression? What do the coefficients mean, depending on the type of regression you're using? The similarities between all of these in terms of the fact that they're models of the mean of an outcome given predictors or explanatory variables, depending on what your goal is. And there's a lot more to learn, of course, about regression in general. Some of which we'll get into more here. A lot of it is just part of basic courses on regression, like 241 and 145 and other 245. All these ones have lots of regression in them. And of course, this course really concentrates on regression approaches. So it's important to be somewhat comfortable with that material, to be comfortable with the material I'm going to talk about. Then there was a lecture on notation, which is all a really thrilling subject. It's unfortunately necessary in this course to have some notation because you're going to be translating the commands you give in Stata into what you're actually modeling, and in your classic regression context, that's relatively simple. In this context, it can be a lot more complicated, and we'll start to see that today because you're going to be suggesting sometimes not just a relationship of the outcome to observed variables that you have in your data set, but also to unobserved variables that you're speculating affect the outcome in particular ways, so-called latent variables. And so you have to know when you write down the code that does this implicitly in Stata, in something like xt-mixed, what in fact the model looks like if I wrote it down as an equation, because it's only then that I can understand what the coefficients mean and the type of variance structure I'm implying and this sort of thing. So the notation isn't gratuitous. In fact, it's the only way to really translate what the output is into what you're actually estimating. And hopefully, I don't expect it to be comfortable at the start from almost 80% of you, but by the end, I promise it for the most part, when I write YIJK on the board, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. We do it through a repetition because notation's hard. There's no doubt about it. And good notation has nothing gratuitous. Like every little bump and wiggle is communicating something about an experiment that generated that random variable or something about that parameter. So that's the thing about notation is it's cumbersome to understand because it's not that we use the little hats and the Greek symbols and the tildes and the bars in a way because we like those shapes. Everything is communicating a different concept. And of course, you have to define what those concepts are. It's not like you're born with innate knowledge of what a tilde means. They have to be defined. But for the most part, across the literature, many of these are defined in the same way. Statistics is not the greatest field for common notation across different authors, and even worse across different disciplines, since every discipline has their own branch of statistics if they do empirical science of some kind. And so sometimes it's like going, every time you're reading something new, whether it's social science or econometrics or public health or statistical theory, it's sort of like learning a new language. But it's kind of like computer languages. Once you get the hang of one, the other ones come a little easier. The logic becomes more apparent once you've suffered through learning one of them. Okay. So, given that justification for having a lecture on notation, I wanted today to sort of give you an overview of what this course is about and what we're, in terms of the more statistical nitty-gritty of why we're doing it and what themes we're going to come back to over and over again. There's kind of, for different levels in this course, for those that don't have a strong math background and stat background, they want to get some basic themes and some basic competence out of this course in order to apply these techniques. And these are some of the themes, in fact, the most important themes that I'm wanting you to get out of the course. So at least you'll have these with you when you go. And then hopefully, coming along with that, you'll have the ability to actually apply these techniques on your own data. For those of you who want a greater understanding of the technicalities behind things, well, I have that material available, and I will go over some of it. But really, in some ways, you have to decide at what level you're possible for you to understand is important for you given what you do. And so I don't expect everybody to necessarily master all the statistical and mathematical detail I put up on slides. So it really should be a function. You're graduate students, you're doing your own research. This is a graduate course. It's supposed to be a function of what is important to you. Of course, you get a D if you don't master it, but that's not true. Okay, so there's some basic major themes, and we've already talked about one of them, and this is codependency. That once I have longitudinal data that particularly has repeated measures on some unit, like a person, over time, then I can no longer make the assumption that goes behind most of the standard regression techniques, and that is that all these observations are independent, because that simplifies things. And this is one equation which shows you how it does simplify things if you can assume independence. So it's very easy to deal. Much, I shouldn't say it's not always easy. It's relatively easier if you have two different types of data sets to propose estimators, that is some kind of algorithmic function that goes in the computer that produces a number, and statistical inference, essentially a standard error that will result in the right p-values and confidence intervals if your data is independent. Once it's not independent, then you end up having to model something else besides, for instance, the marginal variance, how variable y. You model something about the covariance that is how outcomes on the same person go up and down together. And that becomes apparent here. Now, I assume most of you had, what's the first class, 142? Is that the first one now? 142. And so you go over, at some point, rules of expectation and rules of variance. And they probably seem fairly boring at the time and not terribly relevant to your lives, but they become relevant to your lives in this brief hour and a half we meet every Tuesday and Thursday, because it really underlies much of the differences between the regression techniques we're going to learn here and those that they're based on for cross-sectional data where you don't have repeated measures. And here is really just one big formula that kind of says it all, that if I have two random variables, two draws, let's say two measurements on the same subject of CD4 count at two different times, and I want to look at and my experiment isn't I'm just taking CD4 counts on this one subject, but my experiments I'm taking repeated counts on many subjects. So the subject is not my target population, it's just a random draw herself. Then I cannot expect that the two observations are independent. And if they're not independent, that means that the variance of, for instance, their sum is the variance of one of them plus the variance of the other one plus this thing here, the covariance of both of them. And that's where the course often spends time, is how do we create models that allow this kind of covariance, or how do we just simply impose it when we're driving our inference? And so what is covariance? What's just don't give me a technical definition. What do you think of when you think of covariance? Do you not think of covariance late at night? Okay, well, maybe it was just a dumb question. But I'll give you a dumb answer. It's how things go up and down together, right? That's what covariance means. So if a subject tends to have CD4 counts that are high at one time, do they tend to have counts that are high at the other time, or is it sort of random? Does it not matter? Are they more likely to have higher measurements than person I than person I prime? Do two people... Are they not correlated? Are they not more alike within the subject than between subjects? So covariance has a technical definition, which you'll get into in a homework. I have one homework where you sit down and have to do little proofs that with variance and expectation, and it's just basically to remember all those rules of covariance and variance that you were supposed to learn in 142, or maybe you weren't. I don't know, but we'll review them because they're hard to remember unless you're working with it a lot. So anyway, now this thing. Normally in regression, we might worry about the variance of y because that's also still a parameter of interest. We have the regression, we have the line, and we might have some points, and we fit a line there. And so we worry about the line, which is the mean of y given x, but we also might worry about how big that spread is around the line, right? So that might be the variance of y given x. We might worry about one parameter, the variance of y given x. Now, of course, we have this other thing, which we might have to worry about the covariance of y given x if I have, two observations on the same subject. If one's higher, does the other one tend to be lower? How do I model that? And in this case, I can simplify matters in the linear regression case by maybe I assume that it not related to x. That in fact the variance of the residuals around this line are the same no matter what this x is here. Here's the x, here's the y. That would be one simplifying assumption. That's a model. It doesn't tell you everything about the data, but it tells you at least what the variance is given x, and that's a very common assumption. It's the typical assumption embedded in linear regression. And I might assume something like the covariance between any two residuals on the same subject, if I'm doing a regression, are the same no matter what the subject is. That's another model. We will start out by defining things very generally, much like you did in the notation, where you could have notation that didn't suggest there was any model. Everybody has a set of measurements. They might have their own variances for every observation, their own covariance, down to a very small model, which is that means that there's not very many parameters to describe the data. I can describe everybody's distribution in just with a few numbers. So that's a small model. There's few numbers to describe the distribution versus a large model where I need a lot of numbers because I'm not making as many assumptions. Okay, so here is an example, just a graphical example. You might start to model correlation. So I now know I have it. I just wrote down that equation back here, not making any particular assumption about the covariance of yi1 and yi2, just that it exists in some way, that they aren't independent. Just to remind you, independence, right, the variance of yi1, if I have one observation on a person plus yi2, the second observation is variance yi1 plus variance yi2. It just means the covariance is 0 if they're independent. That's what we're saying here. So this is under independence. That's not what we're going to assume anymore. So we can do two things, as I said before. We can just sort of empirically try to figure out what that covariance is. Covariance, if you look at the formula that defines covariance, right, it would be, here's one. It would be E yi1 yi2 minus E yi1 E yi2. So the mean of a random variable, which is just one of them times the other, that's this part, minus the mean of one times the mean of the other. That's this was poorly written. Sorry about that. Well, anyway, that's the covariance. Should just write this on the board. I'm so adept at this. There we go. Covariance is equal to that thing. Covariance, these formulas will be, I have a worksheet for you that has all the basic rules, so you don't need to write this down. Anyway, we can have a particular, now I've defined this thing right here as a mean of one variable minus the mean of two means multiplied each other. Well, I know how to estimate a mean. How do I estimate a mean of a random variable? How do you estimate the mean of a random variable? If I give you a random variable and I say, give me back the mean of it. I give you height in this class. I ask you to give me back an estimate of the mean. What do? It's not a trick question. You take the average, right? Take the average. So I can estimate the mean of the first one by taking everybody's first observation and second observation, and I can take the average of those two multiplied together. That's an estimate of the first thing up there, the EY1 times the EY2. I can also get the estimate of the mean of the first observation by just taking the average, and the estimate of the second observation by taking the average. And now I have three numbers. That's the formula. I put them in. I have an estimate of covariance, right? So, I could just do that without specifying a model. I didn't say anything about the model of covariance in that context. I just said, here is what the formula is that defines covariance generally, and here is now a way of getting a plug-in estimator by just recognizing the fact that a good estimate for the mean is the average. However, I can also sort of motivate what it might be via models. And statisticians love to do this. They love to create models to solve problems. And that is much of what statisticians do. So your problem, you come in, you said your problem is, I know there's an issue here because I have two observations on the same subject. I have a feeling when I run logistic regression and ignoring the fact that I have repeated measures, I'm not doing the right thing. Can you help me? And some people will take the tackles like, well, let's see if it matters if you ignore them, and they'll figure out whether your estimates are still okay, and then they'll figure out, okay, how do you get inference, a standard error, that accounts for that correlation. Others might say, let's stand back and see if we can make a model of the whole process. Let's make a model of your whole data, one that includes implicitly correlation. And this is the most common way it's done in this particular in repeated measures, and that's latent variables. It's the introduction of latent variables. So what I have here is I have two pair of x and y. So we could say viral load is x and CD4 count is y, measured at two different times on the same subject. So this little graph here just represents the data on a single subject. And my causal graphical model suggests that x has an effect on y. xi2 has an effect of yi2. xi1, I could also allow that to have an effect on yi2. I could have drawn this line, but I just didn't in this particular one. Right? I could have done this because it comes before it, so why not? But anyway, I didn't in this case. This is not the most fully elaborated model you could have. It's a simpler model that suggests that once I know xi1 or xi2, xi1 tells me nothing about what's going to happen to yi1. Then I have two latent variables that, for instance, affect yi2. The first one is sort of always we have in things like linear regression when we're specifying not just the mean but the whole distribution, is you have this error term. That's really an error term. And it'll be a case in all these latent variable models. After you have the other latent variables in there, at the end, there'll be an error term that allows some random error on top of the pseudo-systematic variation that's caused by these other latent variables. This is really the one that's unique to this course right here, this alpha I, and alpha is often used for it. Not sure how that started, or we'll have variations on that theme, but alpha I, it has an I subscript right there. So that tells you something. That tells you at least that it should be different by I, which is the index of the person. So this is some random variable. Now, you don't know it's necessarily unmeasured. I have to tell you that, or you might have a special symbol in your graph that tells you it's unmeasured. Sometimes people will use circles to surround them, like I've done there, as opposed to squares if they're measured variables, sometimes called manifest variables, depending on the literature. I might have this, and then these things are circles because they're unmeasured. And that you can see that alpha I, it connects both y's. It's some random variable that impacts yi1, and it also impacts yi2. Right there, I give you some intuition that if I now write this down, I have to connect all those things via some model. That doesn't tell me how they're connected, particularly how they're connected to the y's, but it does tell me that now I might see a relationship between yi1 and yi2 because they share some unmeasured thing. Now, in some disciplines or some applications of the type of techniques we'll learn here, they'll take that alpha I very serious. It will represent something about the person that you're really trying to get at by other variables. This is like the motivation but behind often factor analysis, is that you see a bunch of variables, they're proxies for something you can't measure, like happiness and productivity and whatever, je ne sais quoi, I don't know. They have various characteristics, right, that they will define in psychology or sociology that they hope to be able to get at by measuring a bunch of manifest variables, but these are simple proxies for the real thing they care about, which are these latent things. And when they get estimates of those things and the relationship of them, they mean something because they really are placeholders for this concept they're trying to get at. And usually in our case, they're a mechanism for generating a model that induces correlation. And we can, sometimes people are interested in the alpha I's themselves because it's possible to get estimates of them. They're called predictions because they're not parameters, they're random variables. And if you estimate a random variable, it's called a prediction, essentially. So they're called predictions, and some people might be interested in them. They're often kind of secondary behind the scenes. They form the basis of a model that induces correlation. So if I take this, you could say, okay, well, how do I convert this into something more tangible that implies a specific kind of correlation and a specific or covariance between the two? And you'd have to say more about these things, how they're related. So, I mean, one very, what did I just do? Okay, good. Okay, so one very simple thing might be I do this, right? Yij is alpha I plus, and I'll just say beta 0 plus beta 1 xij plus eij. Now I've defined specifically, if I go back, if I look at that equation, and I might say something else like, well, alpha I is distributed normal. And this is how models are made. You have to start saying things about these that are more specific. In order to create an estimator, you have to create a likelihood. And a likelihood is based on knowing the whole data generating distribution. So you have to start, can't just say there's an alpha I. You have to say something about the alpha I. And you have to say something about alpha I such that you can define a procedure that can estimate the things you care about. Often these things, but maybe some variance parameters too. So you might say it's normally distributed with variance sigma squared alpha. That's what this notation, make sure that's clear. This right here, that means normal with mean 0, variance sigma squared alpha. That's right there is just a symbol that represents it's a number that defines the variance of that unmeasured thing. So now I've specified my first explicit distributional assumption, which is that this thing that's unmeasured is normal. That is the most common assumption. Not because we believe it's true in the world, but it's the most convenient way to get estimates. If you define it in other distributions, you can find that I can't find easy software to get estimates, and so normal is often chosen. Yeah, you had a question? That's a and this stuff will over and over again, and it'll become second nature. But now I'm sure it's abstract, maybe even slightly annoying, but it'll get better. Eij, you'll do something like this. I don't have to say they're independent here because that was part of my model. My graphical model, if you looked up the alpha and the Eij were independent. They were what's the right word? Exogenous variables, meaning they come from somewhere, but nothing is causing them. So they're all exogenous. That's another term, fancy term, people use to describe different types of variables, exogenous variables, in this case. So that means that by definition they're independent. In our data generating distribution, who's ever behind the scenes pulling those levers, the levers they're pulling are like a coin flip of some kind. It's really a random draw from a normal distribution for alpha I and then for Eij. When this will become really clear to you is we have a little assignment. Well, you'll generate data from this kind of model on Stata. You'll see how you put it together, and you'll see, oh yeah, that's what it means. You're now playing God. You're now generating the data which you'll sample from, and you'll see how it's constructed. These models imply that there's something behind the scenes in your data journey distribution that is making these things like this. Again, it's an approximation that you hope is a good approximation to what's going on, but that's the basic idea. And then those things are independent, and so you can start asking questions. What's the correlation of yi1 and yi2 in this model? And that's a mathematical exercise. I've given you everything you need at this point. If I give you all those numbers and I ask you to say, give me the correlation, or so I have to do this. If I say what's the correlation of now yi1 and yi2, that now is a problem that you should be able to work out given the rules of expectation and the rules of variance and covariance, and applying them to this thing. I mean, first of all, I can just write down, correlation isn't quite covariance. It has a different definition, very obviously related to covariance, which you'll learn about. It has a particular definition. It's defined with regard, again, to covariance. I already told you what covariance looks like. And so you would just start doing the algebra. You would put those yi1s and yi2s in the equation, and you would start plugging and chugging. And that's how a proof is done in this simple context. It just turns out in the end to be taking the definition of model and applying the definition of covariance and then doing algebra. That's what it is. Not the most fascinating exercises, but one that helps you see why, when I introduce this alpha I, beyond intuition, does it imply a very specific kind of covariance between observations on the same subject in this case. And I can start doing more fancier things. Like I can say, well, it's not just that they're random. Essentially, if you look at this, it means everybody has a different intercept in this model. If I put these two together, right? These right here. These two numbers together, that's just like a new intercept. I could just define that as, beta 0I, is these two numbers added together. That just means everybody has a different intercept. So there may be a relationship between CD4 count and viral load that I see overall on average, but now that's implying that the intercept between those two can be different from person to person, but the relationship, the slope, the beta 1 in that model is the same for everyone. It's not allowing that people might have different relationships between those two numbers, CD4 count and viral load. But I can generalize that. I can say, okay, well, I'm now going to allow beta 1 to be different, and I can add a beta 1i there. And you can see that this can go on and on. You can start adding where you think the important sources of variation come. Do they come simply in the intercept? Do they come in the relationships? Are they at different levels? If I have more than 2 levels, maybe I have 3 levels because I have classroom and children each measured over time. That would be 3 levels. So I could have different relationships implied, different random latent variables at different levels, and this can get immensely complicated. This is the whole world of multi-level and hierarchical models. The basic idea is you are now trying to explicitly model these sources of variability, and they will imply something about the covariance of observations made on the same unit or subunits or whatever you're looking at. And that exercise is a tedious algebraic and applying rules of expectation and covariance. There's nothing else to it. Is that. So I'll make you do one. I'm not going to beat this. I'm not going to do this ad nauseum, but I will have you do a couple. Actually, just pretty much one exercise in doing this. So at least you suffer once and get the idea of how you translate these things. Some of you will, it'll be like that because you're quite familiar with this. You're a stat student. For others, it's going to be a struggle, and don't worry about it. You just need to get your feet wet and get some intuition for how these models translate into actual predictions for how the relationships occur. Sure. So you have to shout it because I'm. When we'll no way your model's right. And so any departure means if I can bend my model a little bit more, I'm going to favor that if it doesn't add too much variance. And so even though it's done a lot, those kinds of approaches have to be understood for what they are. They are given the variance trade-off, which of various models does the data favor for this particular sample size. That doesn't sound very satisfying because that's not testing overarching theory. But we will discuss methods or choosing between them later using methods like AIC. And I'll have some readings on that. So again, oftentimes you'll also get estimates of the variance because what you get back is you get estimates of these things. You'll get estimates of the variance of the error term and estimates of the variance of the random effect. And maybe you see the estimate of that variance is small, so you include it, but the estimate's saying it's not a terribly important contributor to the variance of my data. And so don't necessarily have to do model selection in order to make those kinds of conclusions because you just look at the variance estimates, which is another way of going about it. Certainly related. Okay, well, this is basically what we just did here. So again, I have some model. I'm not going to, I already did this in the previous written thing. In this case, I'm going to talk about a model where I don't have this thing right here. I don't have any x. I just have a y. So I'm just looking at trying to model repeated measures on, let's say, CD4 count. As I say here, I have m randomly selected individuals. So I have a large target population of people. That's my target population. I take a sample size of m people, and then I follow them over time. And then I get maybe a few measurements on them, and I have this model. And just like the last time, I'm assuming both of these have mean 0, and they're independent. Now, I'm not making, you could infer this in my previous discussion because it was in the graph, right? If I go back, that was in my graph. You can see there's no arrow between, these, implying that they're unrelated. So there's no correlation in them in this normal model. So in this case, I'm not actually specifying that by a graphical model. I'm telling you it. Yeah, that's a subtle difference. You can define graphs of things, which people taking causal inference will learn that you can define something about relationships in a graphical model, or you can just specify in language. I believe that alphas and the residuals around somebody's mean are independent of their means difference between the grand mean being this thing right here. Right, and we'll talk about that in a sec. So again, this is a model. For doing what I'm doing, I don't have to necessarily specify what they're distributed. I don't have to tell you that alpha I is normal, maybe for what I'm after right now. I can just tell you that it's mean 0. And the mean of EIJ, the residuals are 0. So what I'm going to show here is basically a technical exercise in showing why ignoring correlation, that is a naive analysis of longitudinal data, pretending that I don't have repeated measures, can steer you wrong. And this is really one of the important messages of the class, because it steers you wrong in a particular way. It's not so much one aspect of the statistical problem, it's more another, and that will become clear in a bit. So again, I've defined this variance of the variance between individuals. That's just the variance of alpha I. If alpha I defines how subjects are different from one another, then the variance of alpha I is often defined as the between subject variance. Right? This is how you can connect a model of the outcome into variance components analysis, which is trying to estimate what is contributing to the variance among different components. So these are sometimes called variance components. And again, you can specify them outside of a model, or you can specify them as implied by a model, and that's what we're doing here. We have our little model. And you'll show this later in your little homework assignment, but if this is the case, and I do my exercise to find out what the correlation is between two measurements, so again, this is correlation yi1 and yi2, for instance, it's equal to this. I'm just again, that's a symbol that you'll see a lot that represents the parameter of correlation. And it's defined, correlation is defined as the covariance over the square root of the variance of yi1 times the variance of yi2, covariance of yi1, yi2. So, that's the definition of correlation. Nothing to really care about that much except for it's just a parameter. Nothing objective about it being a good one, but it's a fine way to look at covariance because it takes this relationship, which is on the scale of whatever y is, let's say CD4 count, and it standardizes it by dividing by the variance, essentially. So you get how I can compare different random variables. I could compare viral load and its correlation to the correlation on CD4 counts, and those two numbers are comparable because they're on standard deviation units or variance units of each other. They go from a -1 to 1 correlation, and so it doesn't matter if one thing's is in the scale of height, and the other one is in the scale of weight, and the other one is the scale of counts per milliliter. That's a number I can compare. That's why people like correlation. Covariance, you read it, and it's like, I can't compare them because they're on the scale of whatever outcome you're talking about. Anyway, that's the definition of it. So think of it as standardized covariance. And it turns out if I take this model that I just put in the last few pages, and as I said before, I do the algebraic exercise rules, I end up with this thing, that the correlation of two observations on the same subject in this model is the variance between over this right here is the total variance. So that means this is the variance of Yij, the bottom part. This is the total variance. So that's the variance that you see. If I take, and the first question to ask is, what experiment is at the variance? What experiment is the variance sigma squared alpha plus sigma squared e? The between person variance plus the variance of the residual, which is the within person variance. It's the sum of those two things. In what experiment? If I get a random variable in that model and I randomly draw it, how would I have to randomly draw it so that if I did the sample variance of it, it would approach this number plus that number, whatever these two numbers are? What's the experiment? Write down things like this. It has no meaning unless you know what experiment I'm talking about. And I didn't really say it there. So again, at least on this page, you don't have the information you necessarily need to know that's true. If I randomly selected this and took all their measurements and did the variance of their measurements, is that sigma squared alpha plus sigma squared e? No. This is if I have a giant bucket of measurements on everybody, and I randomly draw one, and I randomly draw, and I put it back in, and I randomly draw another, and I do that. So I'm just randomly drawing observations, not randomly drawing observations on a fixed subject or that. It's random draw of observations from a population of observations. So basically, look at my entire data set, and I have all the people, every observation lined up, a different row for every observation, even if it's the same person. And I take the variance of that thing. That will represent this variance down below. And it means the amount of correlation you see, it's sort of intuitive, is that the more between subject variability there is compared to the total variance, the bigger that is, the more the correlation. In this model, is it ever possible to have negative correlation? No. So this is, you can tell, this model has constraints. It imposes something on the data that doesn't allow all possible values of a proper correlation. A correlation can be -1. So it imposes that there's only positive correlation. The model has consequences. It puts not completely what you'd say non-parametric anymore, because it has assumptions, and that is that the correlation is positive. Now, this usually tends to be a fairly benign assumption in most cases, because the only reason we think there's correlation is that some people tend to be different than others, and therefore, if you happen to grab the same person twice in your bucket and look at the correlation of them, they'll be more alike than if you have different ones. Not exactly the opposite. If I grab a person from, and then I grab the same one, they're going to be actually more dissimilar than if I grab one person and take another person. That would be negative correlation, and that's just oftentimes, we can almost impose this model because we know a priori that's just not a likely model for our data. And if that's the case, then this is a better thing to do. It's always best to sort of have the constraints in your model to reflect what you think the real processes are in your data. It makes no sense, for instance, to have a regression that allows the mean to go from -10 to +10 if you know it only goes from 0 to 1. That you're going to have inefficient estimates compared to having a constraint that respects what you think you have good evidence or good a priori understanding to constrain the model. Then you should use that constraint. But anyway, more importantly for right now, it's a constraint. And this is what it is. It's the between over the total. This is oftentimes called the interclass correlation coefficient. It's a very fundamental number that's reported often in longitudinal studies and repeated measure studies, because it gives you, particularly in simple structures where there's just units because it tells you how much data, how much variance is coming from the between subject relative to the total. Yeah?
So the variance of alpha and variance between individuals, that's like a summary of the.
That's a parameter, right? So this is if I had, it would be that if I take the entire target population. So I had everybody in my target population in my sample, and I could measure alpha I. Let's just ignore the fact we can't measure it. I could measure it, and I took the sample variance. That's equal to sigma squared alpha.
But then sigma squared E
Yes?
stays like within an individual, but
Again,
my question is
okay. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
which individual, if we're measuring correlation between.
Oh, that's a really good question. You're saying which individual is it? Well, no, I mean, you just pointed out that you just said, why don't I have an I there, for instance? Let's go back to my model. Did I say anything about that? I said, is the variance of EIJ. So this is where our notation has, I mean, it's a great question. It's not obvious. I'm not saying you should have noticed. But if you look at this right here, this definition, I have the variance of the EIJ is just sigma squared E. That's telling you, I think it doesn't matter what the individual is, they all have the same variance. That's a model. Yeah, that's a model assumption embedded. I mean, again, some of these model assumptions are going to be ones that we really think are motivated by the process. Many of them are for convenience. You can't, it becomes an intractable problem if I'm estimating a variance of the residual for every individual. In fact, it may not gain any benefit if I expand my model to do that when I'm trying to get an estimate of the mean or the regression coefficients. But it's an excellent question. That's because I could have, of course, had a different model there. Okay. Anyways, this is the true one. And what I'm going to talk about is what if I, as I was saying earlier, what if I just do the sample mean and the sample variance of the data, ignoring the fact that there's repeated measures? What screws up about that? Why do I have to take this course? Do I get really bad confidence intervals or bad estimates? What is it about the fact that I'm ignoring correlation that matters? And so we're going to estimate the mean, right? So this is the mean estimate. Again, this is a complicated formula for a very simple thing. It's just the average of all the y's in my entire data set, right? I now have two, it's implying there's two measurements per person. I take all of those measurements, line them up in one column, and I take the average. And the first question is, does that work? Why I have correlation? Is ignoring that correlation giving me a problem here? And the answer in this case is actually no, it doesn't. Let me hold on a sec right here. Let's try something, see if this is better. Never mind. Next time. Okay. So I had this, it was 1 over 2m. Oh, sorry. Is it showing up now? Okay, yeah, a little delay. 1 over 2m. Again, I'm just going to go over this formula quickly because you'll see things like this late j equals 1 to 2, yij. N is the total sample size. It's the number of rows I have in my data set, right? So it's the number of people times 2, because there's 2 measurements per people, so total sample size. And it's equal, of course, to 2 times m. It's just the number of people is m, and then there's 2 per person. So this may look complicated, but all it is summing over all the observations and dividing by the total number of observations. That's all that formula is, just the y bar. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to look at this sum here, and I want to know if it's unbiased. I want to know if that gives me an estimate of the parameter I want. What am I trying to estimate with that? You go back to that original model in the slides. Here was the model. Mu plus alpha I plus eij. Oops. What am I trying to estimate if I take the sample average? I mean, what is the sample average estimate of? The mean. And what is the mean of y in this model? If these have mean 0, it's just mu, exactly. So the mean of yij, if you really just put out all the gruesome details, is the mean of alpha I plus mu plus eij, because that's what y is. In my model, y is those three things added up. Well, that has mean 0, and that has mean 0. I also know that the mean of a sum is the sum of the means, so I know that this is the mean of alpha I plus the mean of mu plus the mean of eij. These are all the rules of expectations. The expectation of a sum is the sum of the expectations. So the mean of a sum is the sum of the means. Now I know that this is 0 here, and that's 0, and the expectation of a constant is just the constant. If I take a sample average of 5, I get 5, right? So when I do all that, which is the proof necessary to know what is the mean of yij, I get the mean of yij is equal to mu. Again, it's that tedious exercise of defining the thing, what I want, then I put in the random variable that's defined by my model, which means I just take the mean of mean of mu plus alpha I plus eij. I notice that I know because I remember my rules of expectation that the mean of the sum is the sum of the means, so I rewrite it that way. And now I know what to do with that because I know the mean of each one of those random variables. 2 of them is 0, and the other one is just this constant. So I know that I assume I'm trying to estimate mu. And so the question is this y bar a good estimator? And I'll say in this case, unbiased estimate. What does that mean? What does unbiased estimate mean? That's actually a more general definition. That's consistent. That means it's consistent. So that's fine. We can use that. In this case, it's not even, we don't even have to worry about sample size getting large. Meaning, so, but anyway, you said, who said I couldn't see? Oh, you said it back there. So what would you say again? But that's okay. What was the first part of your sentence? What? When it gets large, that the estimator goes to the truth. That's exactly right. But in this case, it's so that's of the sample size, the mean of y bar should be equal to mu if it's unbiased. What the heck is that? I get one y bar with my data set, one sample average. So what does that mean, the mean? What's that? It's the mean of the average, but I need several values of it to have an average or a mean. So it means in repeated of this kind. That's an estimator being unbiased. You're saying if I did this over and over again, this experiment where I take the data in exactly the same way and I apply this algorithm which gives me a number, that the mean of that number, as I take enough experiments, is equal to the truth. Robin was talking about something consistency, which is if you have something that's maybe a little biased, that the mean of it will go to the truth as sample size gets larger. In this case, the mean is going to be the truth regardless of the sample size. But the way to think of that is, again, requires, it's this nested thing. I have the sample size of my study, and then I have the number of repeated experiments. When you talk about talking about repeated experiments, that's an infinite number. You're saying in an infinite number of these, if I took the average, it would be equal to mu. But that's the definition of mean. Anyway, that's what we want. We want this to be true. We want to know, and that's a property of an estimator we like. Not the only one. It's not the only thing that necessarily matters, but it's one. That the mean of this thing is equal to mu. And using what Robin said, you could talk about consistency, and I'll put y bar in. Actually, let me use sample size. That in. No, actually, I'll use that's. I'm trying to be technically right here. M goes to mu as m goes to infinity. That would be consistency, and that's a more general. That's a more general term. Consist. I'm sure you can't read this anyway, so why am I bothering? Anyway. Oh, I know you can't read it now. Okay. So I'm talking about this, that I at least would like to show, in this case, that the thing is unbiased, that in fact I'm getting an estimate of something that has the right mean. It won't be equal to mu because in every sample, y bar is a random variable. When I take a new experiment, I'll get a different y bar. It won't be the same number. So I want to use theory to show me that my estimator is a good one. That's where statistical theory comes in. It's like I could do something that's sensible. I think we probably all have the intuition that it works, but I want to rigorously show this thing would work. So I can tell you that this estimate I'm giving you, I know it's not necessarily equal to the truth, but as sample size gets bigger, you'll get a number that goes to the truth. And in repeated experiments of this kind, so if I do meta-analysis and I'm combining studies that I hope are all equivalent, that I'm going to be combining unbiased estimates. So combining them is a good thing. If they're all biased, combining them just gives me the bias. So anyway, that comes back to this technical exercise. Is this thing, what is the mean of this thing? What is the mean of y bar? And that's a technical exercise, so I have to write it out. That's the mean of 1 over 2m times the sum. I'm not going to bother writing down of yij, right? This thing right here is a constant. Do you know what the mean of a constant times, I'll just call this big sum here a random variable. What's the mean of a constant times a random variable? I actually can't hear you, but I'm assuming you said that it's equal to a constant times the mean of the random variable. Right? So now I have that by a rule of expectation. Now, what is the mean of a sum of random variables? We just went over that. It's the sum of the means. 1 over 2m times the sum of, what was the mean? We already did that before. It was mu. So if I take the sum up, I'm summing mu over and over again 2m times, or capital N times. So that means that I'm going to have 2m times mu over 2m, or this is going to be equal to mu. All right, that is just the exercise that shows, when you do this exercise, that in this model, that I have an unbiased estimate of my parameter of interest, mu, by taking the sample average. Did correlation ever come in? We went this whole exercise in the repeated measure part. Where did the covariance come in? It didn't come in, right? going to be one of the lessons in this course. It's oftentimes the case where ignoring correlation does not really hurt you that much on estimates. I mean, there'll be times where you might be able to get more efficiency, so I can reduce the variance of estimation, but oftentimes the bias or the consistency is not affected by ignoring the correlation. Basically particularly in these linear cases where you have essentially, you're estimating something like a sum, because the sum of the expectation of the sum is the sum of the expectations, and there you have it. And so in this case, I can ignore it. So why am I bothering with this course? This has been a pretty boring lecture. Can I drop out now? Wait 1 second. Okay, now I'm not going to go over this part, because in fact you're going to do this by yourself at some point, or something like it. But if I was doing naive variance analysis, that is, I was not taking account of the correlation, I have, if you look at the sample average, it's a sum with a constant times it. So if I'm assuming they're all independent, I have the variance of a sum. Well, if they're independent, the variance of a sum is exactly, thank you, is the sum of the variances. So all I have to do, and they all have the same variance in that model of mine. I'll just assume they all have, they have the same variance. So that means I can just get I have 1 over 2m times the variance of the sum. Oh, I'm sorry, a variance of 1 over 2m times the sum. And if I do this naively, that's going to be equal, that is, I'm going to ignore it. It's going to be equal to I'll just say it now. It's going to be equal to, without proving it, because I don't want you to drop the class yet. This is and I'm getting bored. No. Okay, let me get that right here. So that you get this. If you do it and take that, done. This would be your naive one, assuming that the observations were independent. It would end up being your classic estimate of the variance of a sample mean. It's just the variance of the random variable over the sample size. That's all it is. Sigma squared is S squared is your classic symbol for the sample variance. That's just the sample variance. That's all that is, right? This thing is just your sample variance that you would calculate if I used whatever command to get the variance of a column of numbers. And I divide by the total sample size. That's equal to 2 times m here, right here. And so this is just, without deriving that under the model of independence, because again, I could do that same exercise I did with expectation, and I would end up with an estimate that looks like this. So the question is that okay? Because why am I getting the sample variance anyway? What do I care about? Not the sample variance, but the variance estimate of y bar. What do I care about that? I have the estimate. Is that not enough? Okay, why? Right, exactly. I want to know something about how good of an estimate it is, how much precision I have, right? And I generally want to reflect that in a confidence interval, or I may have a test whether the mean is 0 or something, so I may want a p-value. I need some estimate of its variability, typically in those types of calculations. So I need an estimate of this to do the full statistical package, right? You get your estimate, you get your inference. That's a kind of sloppy definition, but that's what I'm going to use. Estimate, and then the standard error and all the stuff that comes with that, the confidence intervals, the p-values, et cetera. So I need that in order to get it. And so this is calculated this is not a benign calculation. This is calculated under a specific model that the data are independent. We know they're not independent because the model implied that the correlation was sigma squared alpha over sigma squared alpha plus sigma squared e. So we know that there's some correlation there depending on those numbers. Is it okay? Do I still do okay by ignoring the variance, the independence when I calculate the variance this way? Because this was what I would do if I just calculated the sample variance using stat or whatever. And it turns out, doing that exercise I did for the mean, that no, it's not okay. It is different. This is the mean of that estimate of the variance of y bar. So if I did that over and over again in experiments of this kind, and I took the average of that thing, it's kind of, now this is going to like always blows a couple neurons because I'm talking about the mean of a variance estimate, right? So I have a variance estimate over in each experiment like I did, and then I get the mean of it. Is that thing equal to the thing I want it to be? Is it a consistent or unbiased estimate of the true variance of the y bar in repeated experiments? Because when I report inference, it's in the context always of how is it going to vary in repeated experiments of this kind. It's a very abstract concept. I mean, we do things sort of automatically. The confidence intervals are not super intuitive things. They are not telling you about everything that's contained in this experiment. They're saying, what would happen if I did this over and over again? How would my estimate vary? That's what we've chosen as a way to communicate information we have about our parameter. And we do that because, one, it makes some sense. It gives you an idea of robustness. If someone else does an experiment and they get a completely, we would predict they get a completely different number, that tells you I don't have a lot of information about the underlying parameter. If it's if the variance is very small, that says, yeah, no matter what you do, you're going to get this number. So I can say something with some authority about what the true mean CD4 count is, the true height in the population, whatever I happen to be trying to estimate. Anyway, that's the mean of that thing in repeated experiments of that naive estimator, but this is the true one. This is the true variance of the sample mean, right? So this is one of the, I should put this down here. But anyway, this is the mean of S squared over N is equal to that. And this is the variance of y bar. You want these if you want to use the naive one, you want these things to be equal. You want the mean of that thing that you do in repeated samples of this kind to be equal to the true variance, but it's not. You can see it's not by a fairly big factor. There's 2 alpha right here. So it's underestimating it. And that's that's the most typical consequence of ignoring repeated measures in a longitudinal study when you do inference, is that you typically underestimate the variability in repeated samples of this kind. You pretend you have more information in your data than you really do. So you tend to report p-values that are too small, confidence intervals that are too small. Yeah? If we had 10 observations, it would be I think 10. I think it just goes up as a function of the number of observations in the same design. Okay, so what does that mean? And I'll just stop here and just ask if there's any questions. I mean, so the concepts to think about is, one, how when I try to figure out whether something matters or not, what does that mean? And then I have to what that means and define it as bias. At the expectation, we looked at mean, and it that much. But when you do the variance and ignore the correlation, we suddenly get something that appears to be biased if you don't account for correlation. All those are very well-defined. I'm sorry, they need to be very well-defined. When you say does something matter, that's not enough. You have to say what matter means, and I define it as bias. I could have defined it a different way. I could have defined it as the variability of the estimate as opposed to just the bias. That's just one measure of how good you're doing. And then once I do that, it's a technical exercise because I have my model. In that model, I can define expectation of that thing that I'm estimating, and then do the algebra and apply the rules and get the answer. And that's really the process by which we know whether we're doing things works or not. This is what statistical theory does often. is it defines the question in a very transparent way, in a very sort of plain way, and then goes through this exercise of showing whether or not you're getting what you expect, being very rigorous of applying every step along the way the rules that have been proven before. That is the process of statistical theory. We're not going to dive into statistical theory much this term, but this is a nice exercise to show you, that one, we use models to try to account for correlation. These models have consequences in that they assume something that may or may not be true, and that may affect our conclusions. And in the end, we do that because ignoring the correlation has a bad effect, and that bad effect in this context comes through the inference, the p-values and the confidence intervals, which will be misreported. We'll go over that a little bit next time. Thanks.